The Mindful Medic podcast is proudly sponsored by the Medical Benevolent Association of New South Wales, ACT. The MBA is an independent charity that has been supporting doctors in New South Wales and the ACT since 1896. They provide specialised counselling, information, referral and financial assistance to doctors and their families during times of adversity or hardship. Their aim is to provide non-judgmental support so that the doctor or family member recovers their well-being and independence and, wherever possible, returns to their vocation. Their services are free, specialised and no referral is necessary. All contact is kept strictly confidential and they are independent of any regulatory body. Hello everyone and a warm welcome back to the podcast. My name is Cheryl. I am your host. You're listening to the Mindful Medic podcast, and a particularly warm welcome if you are joining us for the first time. So I'm really looking forward to getting into today's conversation, and I will introduce our wonderful guest in just a moment. But as part of the edit process, I get to re-listen to the conversations that I have. And, I found this one even more powerful on the repeat. It's given me a lot to think about and reflect on. And to be honest, has left me with more questions. But it's also reminded me of, one of the great joys I have in hosting the podcast is the community that we are building and growing and the people that it's brought into my life. My guests and listeners, many I've met virtually and many fortunately in person too. So I just want to thank you all for continuing to teach me, to help me get really curious and continue to ask questions.
Because I feel like when I first started, the goal was to make something for a specific audience. But I think I underestimated what it has provided me and how has helped me grow and just witnessing the change within myself. We can unpack that, probably those big statements that I just made. But like the process itself of using voice for change and what that feels like, and understanding like what building a community means, because we use that word a lot. And there's a specificity to it when you have like podcasting and like, oh, community for this means people who can help me, people who are using the same craft to convey a message. And it's just interesting to be in that space in that way.
You just heard from Dr. Raj Sundar, who I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast. Raj describes himself as a full spectrum family physician, which to my mind conjures up images of cradle to grave holistic care. He is an associate medical director and a community organiser. And in this conversation, he'll explain a bit more about what community organising is and what his work entails. He practices in Washington, DC. He is also notably the host of an incredible podcast called Healthcare for Humans that is in its first season and I'm thoroughly enjoying. And we'll discuss it through this conversation. But he describes it as a space dedicated to educating others on how to care for culturally diverse communities so that they can be better healers. He works with others to create systems that treat each person with dignity, respects their history, celebrates their joys, and honours their hopes. His leadership vision is to create conditions that enable others to achieve shared purpose. It's a leadership based on enabling, facilitating, and sharing power. So I found this a very powerful conversation. We discuss the role, the importance of history and story and of our own ancestry, history and stories. Again, we visit themes that we've visited more recently and in the past around values and purpose and belonging and finding that for ourselves. And Raj really emphasises the power of community and role of community, and particularly his work as a community organiser. And I think, most interesting for me has been a discussion around the idea of cultural competence versus cultural safety. And Raj unpacks that in a way that I have never had this previously described to me, and has really opened the door for many more questions and to get really curious about this work. So I think that Raj does a much better job of really eloquently describing many of these topics, and I know that you're going to love this conversation. So let's get into it.
But I really appreciate that concept of cultural safety that I try to bring into the work that I'm doing now, which is that cultural safety includes two different things. One is the patterns, right? Which is people's worldviews, beliefs, values, understanding those. And we already know that, right? That's the cultural competence. It has some flavor of that. But the second part of cultural safety is the power, understanding the power dynamics, both historical and how that's contributed to current marginalization. And then what does the power look like in the visit room, in the organization, because that all contributes to safety as well.
Hi, Raj. It's so lovely. I've already made a boo-boo with the times this morning, but it's great to be able to virtually connect.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to see your face because I do listen to your voice, but nice to
And
see your face with it.
likewise, I find it quite interesting that a colleague who's also been on a podcast, and I think may have his own podcast, had commented that our podcast just podcasters interviewing podcasters these days. And I think that's fantastic. If you hadn't reached out to me, if I hadn't met Mark Shapiro, if I hadn't met Dan Dworkis, Andrea Austin, I really love looking at the creative spaces that you're creating, but also being able to connect and build our own little tribe and community. And I think that helps everyone.
Yeah, I
So,
agree. And there's so many dimensions to it because I feel like when I first started, the goal was to make something for a specific audience. But I think I underestimated what it has provided me and how has helped me grow and just witnessing the change within myself. We can unpack that probably those big statements that I just made. But like the process itself of using voice for change and what that feels like and understanding like what building a community means because we use that word a lot and there's a specificity to it when you have like podcasting and like, oh, community for this means people who can help me, people who are using the same craft to convey a message. And it's just interesting to be in that space in that way.
oh, you're already starting so many interesting threads. And I think I might actually just pick off one of those because, as I understand it, you are a family medicine practitioner, but you're also a community organizer. And I did want to talk about this idea of community because it's a big part of your podcast. Can you tell me a bit about your story of medicine and maybe bring in, what is a community organizer? What does that entail? And what does community mean to you? So there's a few questions, but I reckon we just go with that as an opener.
Yeah, community organizing itself is a field, but there is one, I'll say, model or way to approach community organizing. And it was organized and coined this approach by Marshall Gans. And I think he studied at Harvard. He used it on farm worker coalitions. And there's a lot of history behind that. But I'm just going to use one framework that has been used with community organizing in what he designed, which was that each of us carries a story and being really clear about it, right? The story of me, like what is my story? Why did I make the choices I make? And why am I here? Like me. The story of us, like what is that? What's the story that we're all in together? And the story of now, like why is it important to do it now? And this links to, like you asked me, what's my story in medicine? And we can answer that so many ways, but I've been trying to practice this not in like an artificial way of like trying to succeed, like to make my whatever life on earth into like a 2-minute segment, but just getting people to understand what my values are and what's important to me. So my story, you asked me, how did I get into medicine?
Mm-hmm.
A start back in the village in India, because I've thought a lot about this and reflected about it. And I was like, yeah, I think that's where it started, because my grandparents grew up in a village called Thamankotai, Tamil Nadu, and thatched huts, no shoes, cows, chickens, but they grew up in a life of poverty. Life of poverty meaning they went to bed hungry, not uncommonly. And my grandfather felt like we needed to get out of this place somehow. And his thinking was that I'm going to make my whole family all doctors, because it's going to give us respect and it's going to give us stability that we don't have. So he instilled a sense of achievement and ambition to my parents. He made them study since they were like very little, starting at like 5 a.m. during the day, with the singular goal of becoming a doctor. And I say my parents because my dad's dad is who I'm talking about. But my mom was just a nearby village, and her dad, and my grandfather were friends. If people can connect those dots, because it was all interconnected. So my uncles, my aunts, my cousins, they're all doctors. So this is
Wow.
a family trade.
Mm.
And I became a doctor because I say this a lot too. When I was growing up, people would ask me, hey, like, what kind of doctor are you going to be when you grow up? And that was the question for me, right? And I thought, it was like, wow, I have so many choices. I could go into so many different specialties. But that's where my story starts, because it was um, I'll use this word, not ironically, maybe ironically, is it was I had an arranged marriage with
Mm.
medicine, right? Like
Mm.
they said, this is going to be your career. And I thought, yeah, it seems reasonable enough. People seem to like it enough, and it seems to provide meaning to them. But I lived in India until I was about 8 or so, and then I
Mm.
moved to the US to live with my parents in the East Coast, North Carolina. And most of my life was a life of privilege, right? I was not close to poverty. I was not threatened by it. I was living a life of comfort. The things that I worried about was like, how do I get good grades? How do I hang out with my friends? Hey, like, I'm so excited to play this PlayStation game. I hope I get that for Christmas, right? That's what I was thinking about. Nothing else bigger than myself, because I mean, a lot of people can end up in this situation, but for me, my values can pass down through these generations was achievement and ambition. So I was just trying to achieve the next thing. And a lot of doctors find themselves in there, no matter where they start, because our training can do that to us. We're just trying to do the best we can to get to the next step. We all experience more and more. I'm realizing this feeling of emptiness once you get to that next step, right? Hey, like I did so well in high school, I'm going to get to the college I want. Then I'm going to get into medical school I want. Then I get to the residency I want. And in between, I did a lot of great things that I studied hard for and worked hard for. But every time I got to that place, there was a sense of emptiness, because the next day, the question always was, now what? Right? Like, what's next? Because it wasn't inherently satisfying. And again, a lot of people feel this, but for me, it it was especially powerful because of where I started, because I didn't even have that fear of going anywhere else. So I was just in a place of privilege, trying to achieve things for myself. There's nothing bigger than myself.
Was there
And
any one event though that, I mean, in retrospect, you're able to talk about this very articulately now, but was there any event where you actually, fell in a hole and started to do the work? Because there's a lot of work that has to happen to get to the space where you can actually acknowledge all of what you have just said.
I know, and this is the part of the story, I'll be honest with you, I haven't figured out. Like, what is there a single moment, or is there an example that really resonated with me that got me out of this place? And I haven't been able to identify it for myself, because so much of it was like an internal chaos of like, what is my meaning in this world, right? And we all have that question too. And my journey has led me to different spiritual paths, right? I
Mm.
grew up in a Hindu household. I go to Episcopal church now. I've gone to like these 10-day meditation retreats where I just sit still for 12 hours
In silence?
in silence.
Yes.
Yes, right. So nothing.
I haven't done one of those yet. I have a colleague who's
You
just recently done one.
should.
Yeah, it's
Yeah. And each time there's a pearl that you get that you build on slowly, and eventually who you were does not seem like who you are right now or who you're supposed to be in this world. And I'll say that again, I don't have a specific example. It could be the time that my 5th day in meditation retreat where my hips were like on fire and hurting. And I was trying to understand that this is just a body sensation and trying to be present. And then listening to the lectures about how the purpose of us being here is about 2 things, just being kind and being present. And then you keep practicing it until where you were, again, till where you are now. There's such a big abyss that who I am now is such a different person than I was. I'm saying you all that story because the doctor that I thought I will be is not the doctor I am right now. And it's this iteration of like, how do I become the doctor I want to be? This person that cares for this person in front of me and helps them heal, right? Because there's a kind of doctor that I could have been, which is a problem-solving doctor, enacting evidence-based medicine, and then going home, building up my 401k, which I don't know, you're in it, but like trying to maximize my own wealth, supporting my family, and then kind of just living my life that way. But I wanted to be more intentional and purposeful in what I had already decided I would be doing with my life.
And so what did that look like when you made a conscious decision that this was important to you in your practice? How did you start? Where did you start?
Yeah. And the first thing that happens is because we're all in a system that sometimes doesn't allow us to have space or room to think bigger because like we're trying to protect ourselves too in many ways, right? Like we made something that could have been a calling, being a doctor, a healer, into a job because we had to. Like we had to see as many patients as we can because we only have 15 minutes, because we got to get home to our family and it can't be doing this extra effort for this patient right now. So there's a self-protective component of it. And I had to acknowledge that to myself, and that still exists, right? And I think I need to be honest with that because I'm always grappling with that too. When I see a patient and my current tools are inadequate to address them in primary care, there's one way I could approach that, saying, sorry, like we really can't, acknowledge my limitations, and then move on. Never think about it twice, right? I could, and maybe that's good for me, for my well-being. But there's another part of it, which is like being open to what's happening, understanding the systemic causes that I can't make change right now with, somehow finding a way to advocate for better change. And we all have different skills, right? It could be policy, it could be speaking up in your own organization, it could be community organizing. So you're going to do that. And then 2, for this patient, I can't cure their illness, but what does it mean for me to care for them, right? Like there's not a single medication I can give for this person who's suffering with diabetes, can't afford the insulin, we can't find the money anywhere. But how do I make sure I don't abandon them and just say like, sorry, we can't help you. Just make an appointment when you need to, right? So for me, it's trying to remind myself of the latter and then building off of that in the ways that I'm able to, and building the skills necessary to advocate at a bigger system level or organize with the community, and then being more human in the clinic room or visit.
Yeah, and I think that's at the crux of that humanity of clinicians and their patients and the connection between the two. I think that's at the heart of your podcast. And, it strikes me that our vocation is still a strength. And, we talk about this idea of moral distress, and it's the disconnection that we actually feel so removed from the reason we went into medicine. And for many of us, that was to care, and it was that connection. That's what still brings me most joy in my work, but also connecting with my colleagues. So tell me about the idea for the podcast. I'm going to have everyone listening to it by the end of this, but it's fantastic. I think your focus is on patients, but by by getting involved in that, I think you connect clinicians as well. So tell me about the idea, and we're going to go into unpack a bit more of the journey today because there's so many pearls.
Yeah, thanks for making room for talking about all those things because this fits in there, right? Because I was trying to be a doctor that I wanted to be, that I thought I could be, but I didn't know how. A patient who is 80-year-old Cambodian comes to my visit, body pain everywhere, has seen numerous specialists. We don't know what's going on. And I'm there. I'm not sure how to help her. And I'm not sure if she'll share with me all the trauma she's been through, what her history is. She just feels body pain. Or, I do prenatal care and obstetrics to a Somali woman who feels like she does not want a C-section. She wants vaginal delivery, and it's in God's hands, right? And there's a whole thing we can dig into that about what's our professional duty, what does honoring cultural preferences mean. But in all these instances, I just felt like I was lacking a general knowledge, awareness, and approach to caring for these patients. And I want to acknowledge that there's resources that already exist for what we say cultural competence. Most of them are written resources. And there are some places where you can get stories, but the written resources, it falls into this problem with cultural competence, where one, it can be kind of stereotyping. It says, hey, like this community has these 3 values, they dress like this, and they say these things.
Yeah.
And that wasn't
it's a mandatory module, and you need to do it every 2 years.
Yeah, exactly right. And that wasn't it. And that too, like every article has the sense of, hey, like we're the normal ones, and check out these exotic others that we can study and list. And then you take a module and you become competent in their culture, right? And then now you can care for them, which both of them were very limiting. Not every resource did that, but when it comes to the written word, sometimes that is what came out. And I wanted a different way of understanding the culture that would actually inform the way I care for the community and the people that are in front of me. And I love podcasts. Hey, we can bond with this because I know you do too, Cheryl.
Are we on the 4th or the 3rd generation of podcasting? I've been a podcast fan for decades now.
I know you're probably one of the OGs. Because now there's like 5 million podcasts. I don't know what the most recent number is. Yeah, it's like crazy, right?
And I think more in America, still more in America.
Yeah. It's a whole industry, but I listen to podcasts because I have 2 kids, 2.5 and 12 months, and I don't have time to do a lot of things. But podcasting is so easy because it can be the second thing you're doing, usually dishes, chores. Try not to do it with my kids, but when it's the third game of putting the towers together, which I can do without thinking about it too much. But again,
it's good multitasking.
Yeah, or on my drive. So there's these places that made space for podcasts for my own learning or entertainment. Just having that space filled gave me something that I felt was missing in my life because life's just so busy, right? I said I have 2 kids, I have all these work roles. And then I realized like there was something important with podcasts, which was the voice, the conversation, the stories, and real people that just conveyed the essence of cultures way better than you could through other mediums. And as you said, like it's not the written word, it's not a required module. It's just we're just talking. We're being real, and you're going to tell me like how are we falling short and what does it mean to care for you?
I love the way you open your podcast. Let's learn together. Let's go on this journey together. I'm learning too here. And I think you really open up the door for your listeners. I'm learning a lot, and what you've just said there about culturally sensitive care for a diverse group. And we are a diverse group. And it's truly patient-centered. I think this has come up through your podcast, but I just keep thinking of this experience that we've been through as a world, and the need for deep community engagement. Again, we're back to community, and how important that was through a global pandemic where, that's public health 101. And I think we saw that around the world, that we needed to engage community leaders. We needed to think about language and other cultural barriers to actually try and get information to people and explain to them what was happening. And we didn't have the tools in many cases. So, I mean, I'd love from your own experience of now speaking to a number of guests and any reflections on that, because I think you do unpick this through the podcast.
Yeah, and I'm constantly learning, right?
Mm,
Because my goal was to become better, and this is a way for me to sit down with somebody to talk for like a few hours, which I don't get in my clinic, which is 15 minutes. And then now I don't place the burden on the patient to explain something about their background,
mm,
and hoping others get the same from that. But to your note about, we realized this gap during the pandemic, and it was almost like too late to address it, and it almost seemed inauthentic, right? Hey, like, people don't want to get vaccinated. Let's go in the community, understand their values and beliefs, and then get them vaccinated. Like, we already knew what we wanted to do, so all these things in between was to understand so we can overcome them. Like, hey, there's a sense of like these silly values and beliefs. We know vaccines work. Let's go convince these skeptical folks how they should trust them, no matter what their history is and values are. So the context, I think, made it really hard because, as I said, it was like the wrong timing. Um, and that's an approach that I learned too, right? When you're listening to people, you want to listen in an open way, not in a way that you already know what you want to do. And I think healthcare does that a lot with cultural work. And that is true for a lot of the communities that I've talked to so far. I haven't talked to a lot of them, but I've talked to enough. And that's like painfully clear about they want self-determination, they want autonomy, they want to be respected, they want to be honored in the things they believe and the values they hold because there's a history to it. There's some ancestral knowledge that's been carried on through it. And they're not stupid because sometimes we approach it like, hey, like, those things don't make sense. Like, come to Western medicine and our healthcare paradigm, like, we've figured it out. They want to know, like, hey, like, we're not stupid. We will take the things that we feel like will work.
yeah.
But this system that you all are trying to sell to us hasn't showed up previously. So
Mm,
we need
mm.
to like experience that over a long period of time to trust that because that hasn't happened before.
Oh, you just made me think of, I'm a big runner, and I watched a wonderful, um, I think it was a Netflix documentary about a female runner from the Tarahumara um, population, and she was like a champion. She lived in a remote village with her brothers, and she wasn't allowed to go to school, and they walked 3 hours there, 3 hours back every day to go to school. Her dad ran, and she would run in the mountains. And she started to enter a couple of races, and she would run in a skirt and sandals, and she would win. And it was ultra marathoning. And I think it was Salomon that sponsored the Netflix documentary. And there's this, it's all translated, but there's this
Yeah.
fantastic picture of her in her hut, and they've sent her these fancy running shoes, these Salomons, and she looks at them and she kind of picks them up, and the kind of interpretation of it is, why would I wear these? The people wearing them are always behind me. It was just gold.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
The lens. So you started to mention history, and I was really relieved to hear you say that you didn't really like history when you were a student. And I don't know. I think maybe it was my teaching experience, because I do love story and I love the power of story, and I think that's why I love podcasting. But you and Malcolm Gladwell have made me change my mind about history lessons. There are
Oh
so
my
many.
gosh, who knew I would be in the same sentence as Malcolm Gladwell? Cheryl did
I thought you might like that.
it.
There are so many great history lessons in the podcast, and you make it accessible. Can you share some of your favorites? So, what have you learned, and your own kind of relationship with story and history going through the process?
Yeah, I don't know where to start with history. My experience has been also bad. Meaning uh, it was so dense, and I thought like history meant memorizing dates for tests, or it's really skewed towards U.S. history where like people, like we talk about who gets highlighted are the winners,
Mm.
and it's
Yeah.
often white men in history, right? Overwhelmingly, but also in the US. So there's this distance from your history and this history that you're taught. Um, and just how it's conveyed to you. It's kind of dry, and what the point of it was kind of unclear. So I think I try to, because of my history with that history, at the podcast, I try to make it more accessible because I need it to be more accessible because I just
Yeah.
need to know why are we learning this history and how does this connect to what we're doing now and what does it mean going forward? Because history is important because it helps us understand how we got to where we are and can also help us plan the future, right? There's a point to history if you couch it like that. And I usually let the community leaders take the lead on what history means. I do my research and I try to highlight the big dates, try to give people some context, but I get to the crux of it. So it could be for the Somali community that there was a lot of colonialization with 4 or 5 different countries. You don't need to know the dates. You know there's been a lot of harm done, but know that all these countries were there for a period of time. Then it led to civil war afterwards.
Yeah.
And a lot of people left that country and that state. And we don't have to say that everybody believes this, but you could imagine why people are skeptical of Western medicine or people that were historically harmed them now trying to care for them, quote unquote, and saying, hey, my way is better. You need to ignore what you learned to understand about your body, right? That context helps you see that problem, quote unquote, in a different way. I think the other example that I use when I'm trying to get people to understand that cultural competence is different from cultural humility, sensitivity, safety, there's all these terms that we can unpack or not unpack, is in the Hawaii episode, we talk about introductions.
Yeah.
There's this annoying thing that people do, especially clinicians, if they're in a community where there's Native Hawaiians, they always talk about their vacation because they walk into the room like, I want to build rapport. So they're trying to be good hearted, right? I'm not going to rush through this. I want to build this relationship. And think about how do I connect with them? I'm going to talk about the vacation that I just took in Hawaii without understanding or at least acknowledging the history, which is that people left Hawaii because it's become too expensive because of tourism. And they sometimes can't even go back. Not universally true, but for a lot of people it is. And here you are noting that same point and using that to build relationship when you're actually doing the complete opposite. Because now the patient in front of you sees you as this foreigner, right? One, and you're reinforcing the idea like this person won't get me because this huge thing that's affected my life, they're clearly making an innocuous comment to them, but they don't understand. And then they have to go and talk about their vulnerability, about why they're there, what's hurting them. And then they have to believe you that you have their best interest in their heart. So the history helps ground you. There's not always an obvious example, but almost always it helps you approach the community and the encounter differently because the place you start from is different and the empathy that you have is more authentic.
Yeah. And look, developing that idea of history and story, I wanted to transition the conversation slightly, but also go back to something that you said, I think, very powerfully in your introduction when you were speaking about your own family's history and story in India, and that how that context, how that story has influenced your journey subsequently. I mean, I when listening to that, it really impels me to reflect on my own family story. We both have migrated to different countries. You were 8. I was a bit older when I first came to Australia. And I'll move on to talk a bit about that. But I recognise the power of grandparents, albeit different country, different context. But I am very conscious. My privilege is, the relative poverty, hardship, hard work, and really commitment to building a better future and lives for their children of my great grandparents, my grandparents, to provide education to allow them to be able to have that better future. I don't have a family full of doctors, but I'm the second female in my family to go to university, and that is my privilege, and it's something I do reflect on frequently. I wanted to, though, move on to that experience of being in a different country. And, my podcast has a focus on clinician, you say provider well-being, and their experience. And so here I am considered an IMG, an international medical graduate, although I'm now a dual citizen. But I'm conscious that we are a very diverse group, are the IMGs in Australia, and I have had a very different experience from some of my colleagues coming from other countries. In fact, I have had certainly some hurdles to navigate, but they seem, in comparison to other colleagues who've had to retrain as doctors, many have worked as hospital porters, through that training, having to basically, do everything again. It really, my hurdles kind of pale into significant insignificance. And, we know that in Australia, our IMG doctors, our doctors in training, our First Nations doctors are more likely to be victim to bullying, harassment, undermining, and with a concomitant risk of anxiety, depression, emotional distress. And, we also know, though, that peer support and mentorship with mentors who have similar lived and cultural experience can be a real source of support and strength. And so, I'm just curious what your experience of that is in your working environment and what you have seen work well.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question for me because as an Indian American, in the US at least, last stats, there's a lot of Indian doctors, right? We can explore that thread too, but we don't need to. It's just there's a lot of Indian doctors. At the same time, a big problem in the US is lack of representation. So technically, I'm overrepresented as a person. A lot of patients who live in the US actually can't find a doctor with the same type of melanin they have.
Yeah.
Black doctors, Indigenous doctors, Latinx doctors. So there's a need for a better pipeline strategy. Pipeline meaning, how do we support people to become doctors, which a lot of people are capable of, but there's so many systemic barriers that many people never get the opportunity or never even think it's a possibility for them. So ultimately, I think that can lead to better care because there's a part of cultural humility and all of this work that we don't need to do if there's actually the community with us and we could educate each other. But that's not the case right now, right? And I full-heartedly believe that people get harmed because not only are they in the minority, like there's one Black doctor in a group of 40 doctors. That's not unusual, right? So it feels like they're an outsider, or a Latinx doctor, whatever, right? They feel like they're an outsider and they get these moments of harassment from patients because, number one, they're not seeing that kind of person be a doctor. So they're either intentionally being unkind to them or outright racist or just having implicit bias, right? This common thing of, hey, you must not be the doctor, you must be the nurse or the student, right? Because you're not the doctor. So there's just continued like microaggressions or I'll say explicit aggressions there. So we know people suffer like that. So I think your question was around like, what have I learned from doing this maybe, or just working in the environment that I'm working in? Yes, there's like room for peer support, all of these like smaller interventions to support the individual, but we need to focus on the systemic problems too. So like we need to be wholeheartedly committed to changing just the type of workforce we have right now. And I brought in myself because we all need to support each other to make that happen. But the other part that I was going to say was like, even with my Asian colleagues, this is why I wanted to acknowledge that first. So let's say I have a lot of Asian colleagues. And now we're getting to like, okay, there's a lot of Asian doctors. They must all be doing well. And this part of this thinking also exists. And we need to challenge that because that's what came out in maybe the Indian episode and China
Yeah.
episode, because we talk about the model minority, because there's this collapsing of the Asian American identity, like thinking of only certain people who excelled and not thinking of like Cambodians, right? Or Laotians or people from the Hmong community. So collapsing Asian American to this large bucket when every community is actually different. And there's actually a large wage inequality in there. And there's an expectation that comes with Asians must be successful. This idea of model minority, like they're the exception to the minority, they're succeeding. So number one, you're the group that's being pitted against these other groups to show that you're successful. And two, you're almost made to be invincible, like a superhuman. So all of those also exist simultaneously as not equal representation. And I think with the episodes that I'm wanting to also convey to people these other messages, so with their colleagues, they're better colleagues. Like you can support each other better too. Because now when you see your Asian colleague doing well, you can also ask them like how they're doing. You don't have to assume they're doing well, right? And they might not have it all together, or they might need help. Just nobody has asked them because they're always assuming they're doing well.
Yeah, and of course, I completely agree with you on policy to support systemic and cultural change. But, with what this looks like at its best, and if you were to implement one or two things immediately, what would you do? What would it look like? What would you like to see done better at this point in time?
We just have to start from very early childhood, right? Like you start from when people are kids. Why am I a doctor? Because my grandparents and parents always said I would be. Then they thought I could be. Yes, I had some skills. I was good at studying. There's all these other factors, but there's a hopefulness and confidence in me becoming a doctor. And a lot of children don't get that.
Yeah.
Right? Like that is the foundation. Like, hey, like you can be a doctor if you want to, and you will get the support you need, and being able to confidently say that. So once you start that from early childhood, then you can start to work on addressing all of the barriers, which is there are some financial barriers. We know that. There is barriers for opportunity because a lot of people never interact with a doctor easily unless they're really sick or they've never seen a doctor that looked like them. So again, that confidence and belief that you could be a doctor is low. Then as they get into high school, yeah, exactly. And then they get into elementary, middle, and then still no exposure. Nobody in their family is doctors, right? They don't know what all these exams are, like what kind of extracurriculars they're supposed to be doing. So at every step of the way that probably I took for granted, people aren't getting the same exposure or opportunity. So we could, and people are doing this work out there, right? A lot more than me and really working on this pipeline workforce. But I just want to convey that intentionality from like day one rather than, hey, like, how do we get people like in college to want to be in medical school? Like, we really have to start way earlier.
Have you had any feedback from your patients who've listened to the podcast?
My audience is clinicians.
Yeah.
So I have actually a few patients that have listened to it. And I'm just thinking about one who really likes the history too, because he felt like he was a better neighbor. That's what he told me, is that, hey, like now I can't believe all the things that this community has been through. And, like we have few living next door. And I just feel like now I can be a better neighbor because I just didn't know. Again, this information's out there, but not in the way that I'm trying to make it accessible for certain folks. And he thought that it was really helpful for him in that way. And in other ways, I mean, it's just made me a different doctor, not only like specific content pieces that we talked about, right? We talked about Native Hawaiian community introduction, so being cognizant about that. There are specific nitty gritty about like supplements from the Somali community or like metaphors that I got from the Pacific Islander community. But like on top of that, it's just the curiosity that now is transferred over to my daily day, if that makes sense. Meaning my visits. It's now I'm so much more curious because I have a foundational knowledge that I can build on. So the questions I ask are different. And this just happened this month. So I was using this as an example when people were asking about the podcast or just how things are going was I had an Ethiopian couple that I saw, and I knew their Christmas and their New Year's were different than ours. And everybody was asking people like how was your New Year's, Happy New Year's, and this was like 2 weeks into January because nobody knows when to stop saying that. and but I knew for the Ethiopian community the calendar was different, and I knew actually their Christmas for a long time and their year was different. I didn't know the exact dates and I hadn't memorized that, but when I saw them, I said, "Hey, like, how was your Christmas?" And they were kind of caught off guard because everybody's been telling them like Happy New Year's, and they're not going to be like, "Hey, it's not my New Year. Like, our calendar's different." So they were caught kind of off guard. It was like a surprise, and that surprise led to a connection
Oh,
because then they were like, "Oh, like this is actually how it went." Like
it's
people haven't
so
asked me about that.
powerful.
You know what I mean? And it made a huge difference for me and that patient, no matter what the follow-up was and before, because they're like, oh, like I don't have to assume nobody really gets me. Like somebody knows something about me. They asked the right question, even if I didn't know everything. So that foundational knowledge created a moment of connection that didn't exist before.
Yeah, that moment of connection is really powerful and really, I think, has the ability to completely change a consultation. No, wonderful. And I think on that connection, I really, really love your focus on the podcast and your conversations around food. I think it's a core part of the cultural experience. It's powers for healing, connection. Um, and I think also you bring in, and hopefully we'll talk about the context of engaging and advising patients on lifestyle and preventative health. But I love food, and most runners do. And I've been chuckling away at some of the cliches that have come out through the conversation. So when you were saying chicken tikka masala is not Indian food for me, and I'm thinking to myself, and haggis and neeps and tatties aren't what I have, every weekend. And actually, the deep fried Mars bar, it's actually quite a hard thing to find. I remember going on a hunt for one in Scotland many years ago, and I think I found a deep fried Bounty. And then I think it was about 15 years ago, I was in South Melbourne here in Australia, and the local chippy had a deep fried Mars bar. Um,
Yeah,
the, I've
yeah.
I've loved, some of the content around that. And when you were talking about the mangoes and, the mangoes, like proper mangoes dripping down to your elbows, it made me think, the first time I ever had a mango, I was in my mid-20s. I'd come to Australia. No, I think I was a medical student, and I'd come from Scotland to Australia, to meet some friends who were traveling. I had family here, and I'd been when I was young. But I remember we were staying up on a farm up in Uralla in Queensland, and they brought in from the farm this tray of really fresh mangoes, and I was like a kid in a sweetie shop. And I remember again, it was that just dripping down your face. And I remember going back to Scotland after that and talking about mangoes, and I found a mango in the supermarket, and I think it must have cost £4. And it was from
Wow.
Mexico. It was a Kent
Yeah, yeah,
mango.
yeah.
And it was like, I think you would have needed a chisel to open it. I was so
Not the
disappointed.
experience you were hoping for. Certainly. Yeah.
So tell me, I mean, I'd actually like to start about the importance of food for you, because you do talk about it a lot on the podcast. I know it's important. Your food memories, what foods bring you home. And then we'll maybe go on to talk about some favorite food podcast stories.
Yeah. I I talk about dosas a lot
Oh,
because
I
when people
love
think of
dosas.
People think of Indian food as rice and naan because there's actually a lot of North Indian restaurants and
Mm,
it's hard to find a South Indian restaurant. But India itself is so diverse.
mm.
And I grew up eating dosas, appams, idiyappams. People haven't heard about this, but my favorite food item is my late grandmother who made for breakfast this thing called appam that I just mentioned, which is
Mm.
like a crepe. It has a special batter. with ingredients that I should know more about. I just remember what it looked like, and I know what it tastes like. And she
Oh,
would make fresh coconut milk, like because my grandmother made every meal and would get fresh ingredients for all of them, like the coconut. She would shave it like in front of me in to make the milk, and I would eat it with off of it. And it was one of the best meals, and I would look so forward to it, right? And we all have that kind of connection to
mm,
food, like memories, moments, and people. Uh, and with healthcare, we make food like so functional, right? Something you eat for your health, but food means so much more. Um, so that was a good question about what brings. Nobody's asked me that in a while, so I just remember that. But use dose as an example because not a lot of people don't know doses either, and that was like a common thing
yeah.
that we eat in South India.
Yeah, thank you. And again, you're taking me right back. And, I kind of love that a side theme of this conversation has been a celebration of our grandparents. Because you've now transported me to suburban Paisley, to the home of my Nana and Grandpa Welsh, who had this amazing vegetable garden, a greenhouse, many different vegetables and fruits that they would grow. They had the composter. There was always lots of potato peelings. We're Scottish, and my nana not infrequently in the kitchen making homemade soups and salads, and then I was sitting around the table to eat. And we're trying to reclaim that garden to plate, and we know how important that is for health. Not a deep fried Mars bar in sight there. And I think building on that, what has really come out through the conversation is the importance of meeting people where they are when you're having food conversations, and context and culture, because we talk about the importance of the Mediterranean diet, for example, for health, but that might actually not compute it. It might get lost in translation and not actually have any meaning to that person in their culture and their experience of food. And so I'd love you to give me some reflections based on the conversations you've had on that. What have you learned, and has it modified your practice and your approach to your patient consultations?
Yeah, this is a good time to bring in the idea of just cultural safety, which is
Mm.
a term created in New Zealand, um, specifically caring for the Maori population,
I didn't
the
know that.
indigenous population. Yeah, and it was created by some Maori nurses.
Mm.
So that terminology is actually way more prevalent in New Zealand, Australia, and some Canada,
Mm.
less used in the US. But I really appreciate that concept of cultural safety that I try to bring into the work that I'm doing now, which is that cultural safety includes two different things. One is the patterns, right? Which is people's worldviews, beliefs, values, understanding those. And we already know that, right? That's the cultural competence. It has some flavor of that. But the second part of cultural safety is the power, understanding the power dynamics, both historical and how that's contributed to current marginalization, and then what does the power look like in the visit room, in the organization? Because that all contributes to safety as well. I'm bringing that component of power in because that example that you used of Mediterranean diet, hey, like I used to do that. Like I was talking about Mediterranean diet all the time. And nobody said like, hey, I'm not going to try that. So I assume like, hey, like they learned something and maybe they'll change some of their diet. But I didn't acknowledge the power because not a lot of people, I'll say nobody, is going to challenge you outright. Say, hey, like this advice is not going to work for me. I'm not going to do it. You're telling me it's going to be good for my health, but this doesn't seem feasible for me. Because of that power dynamic, either there's some guilt or shame saying like, hey, like I don't value my health enough to challenge, like if I challenge you right now, that's maybe what you're going to get out of it. Or like I'm relying on you for a lot of things and I don't want any kind of conflict to exist right now, right? So people don't get that feedback when their counseling isn't actually that helpful. And the food is such a good example because we do it we do it a lot where we get into the specifics of food recommendations without acknowledging all the things food means to people, including community, family, as we talked about, memories, and like your identity. So trying to get people to change their food completely because of something that's happening in their body is sometimes impractical, but also probably not the best thing for the patient, their mental health. And like you're telling them to not eat all these foods and a holiday is coming up, everybody's going to be eating it together. You want them to sit in a corner and bring their own fish and a glass of wine. Like, is that what you're like
Yeah.
asking them to do with Mediterranean diet? Um, so there's this like practicality and inaccessibility to that advice. So my approach with the podcast of the food is it's evolving a bit because I first started, I didn't really know how to approach it because I would ask about like, well, these are the foods, and you read about like, hey, like your culture uses like too much oil, too much
Mm.
butter, too much. Like you're always like criticizing this other culture's food on why it's not optimized for health,
Mm.
and evolving that thinking to like, hey, like your culture, your community has lived off this food for a long time and they've survived a long time and have lived well. In this context, in America, in the systems that we're part of, where you don't have time to cook, you don't have time to like get real food or eat meals slowly and listen to your body, people are unhealthy. Is there changes that we can make in this environment to how you're eating, maybe returning back to what your original food was supposed to be, or we can choose parts of the food that you like in our current environment to complement how you're eating, right? And that is such a nuanced way to approach nutrition.
Mm.
And I'll couch that in saying none of us have time to do that, right? But
That
I
was my
don't,
next question, 15-minute consults, because you really opened up you really need a lifestyle medicine hour-long consult to really explore that with patients.
yeah,
How do you do that now? Because that's what
I
you
know.
want to do. You run late.
No, and that is not that can always be the solution, run late, right? But it actually takes me equal amounts of time to do both because there's one way where I say, hey, like here's evidence-based dietary recommendations and patterns, Mediterranean diet, DASH diet. Here's a list of food items, people, and then I try to get them to understand what the food items are because they're all kind of foreign to them, and then tell it to them. But that's not the whole time. I see them the next time and they haven't done anything. So then we talk about the same thing again. So there's a repetitiveness to that conversation that actually is the true time of that consultation
Mm.
versus how I start this conversation where it's like, hey, like I know you're eating lots of different kinds of foods. I know some of them. I know, for example, for the Ethiopian community, I don't know if you're eating injera right now, but some people substitute white
Mm.
flour instead of teff.
Yeah.
Are you doing that? And is that changing your diet? Is there a way to return to what it's supposed to be, which is teff, or to find another alternative white flour?
You
And
spoke
they could say
about
yes.
accessibility and expense of TEF.
Exactly, right. So the next conversation I have, they may have tried it. So now we've actually made some progress. And the initial consultation, I just focused on one small thing, sort of radically changing their diet. Again, this is by no means perfect, and it's not what an ideal system looks like. I would
Mm.
love to have all the time to provide individualized care. So there's a part of me that advocates for systemic change, and there's a part of me, maybe it's my Buddhist tendencies, to accept the parameters and constraints and tries to do better in those constraints.
But that's
Um,
essential. That's
right,
essential for
right.
self-preservation.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
But you're still acting within your, scope of influence. So you're.
Exactly.
Mm. So we've spoken about food. I also had down here coffee. I've really loved some of the conversations around coffee and learning, for example, about the Ethiopian culture and the rituals around coffee, at all hours of the day and night. But also the kind of side dialogue around that in terms of patient consultations. If you did have a patient who was suffering, potentially adverse effects of excess caffeine or anxiety and palpitations, for example, and being able to introduce that in, a lifestyle medicine appropriate conversation. What else have
And
you
I think it's
learned?
so fun because now I'm like, hey, I want to do an Ethiopian coffee ceremony. So I actually called an Ethiopian restaurant, and they're going to do it for my clinicians here, and we're going to do it. So I get ideas like that also because I don't think it was on my list to do an Ethiopian coffee ceremony, but I'm like, hey, this sounds fun. We're not going to do it at 9 p.m. We're going to do it at 11 a.m.,
That
but
sounds
we're going to do
great.
this
I'm
and
in.
we're going to have some fun. So I feel like there's engagement in ways that are surprising and unexpected that I get. because of just things that I'm hearing that I didn't know before or didn't think about. Like, wellness activity before did not involve Ethiopian coffee ceremony for me, but people are excited. They're so excited to do this.
We have just spoken a little bit there about time constraints, and again, I'm making an assumption, but this idea of Eastern and Western health and adding in lifestyle elements of medicine, but also using your evidence-based practice. How do you marry that? Because it seems to be an important part of your holistic approach to care, particularly as a family physician. How else is that model developing for you? And again, you've mentioned your Buddhist tendency to be able to then accept it, but there must be conflict there at times.
Yeah, there's always dissonance, an emotional dissonance of what you want and hope for things to be and the reality of things, right? So although I've accepted it, I think I feel that dissonance still of time pressures and patient expectations, and just a lot of barriers, right, to providing the excellent primary care that primary clinicians sometimes want to provide. But at the end of the day, I feel like I'm doing a better job than I was before. And I think that it's satisfying to me in a way that I'm growing and there's an intentionality to it that I didn't have before. Because I do feel like I approach patients differently. And I'm spoiled in some ways, right? This doesn't, I think, this is not true for a lot of people because I have a relationship that I'm building. As a primary care physician, my hope is I'm going to see you again. And this is just the start of a relationship. And hopefully, through this journey within this relationship that we're building, we can get somewhere that is more hopeful for you, that you've healed in some way wherever you started, whether it's mental, physical, or emotionally. And I have the essence of time in that way, even though I don't have it in that encounter. In a longitudinal period of time, I have that. And not everybody has that, right? But I think that's helpful for me to think of it that way, and continue to do the work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's aspirational, actually. I think the work you do as a family physician is essential, and it's the most important work in healthcare. And we have to deeply invest and support and resource it. And I think there's a lot of discussions around this at the moment, because I think it's ultimately what is be a key part of transforming healthcare going forward. We're seeing this fragmentation of primary care here in Australasia and in other countries. And the AMA entitled a recent paper on the GP workforce and why the neglect must end. There's an anticipated shortage of over 10,000 GPs by the end of the next 10-year period. Patients are older and sicker. It's no longer a financially viable model here. And our GPs are becoming sick. We're losing rural GPs. People are no longer training in general practice and primary care. And, I'm seeing that overspilling. And again, it talks about building that community and connection and the bridges. I'm seeing now patients that I don't have the skills and tools to treat in emergency. I can manage you well in crisis. There are many patients that I'm seeing that had we had the infrastructure to support and care for them, in the community, I wouldn't be seeing them.
Are not what you were expecting, right? For things that you don't have the solution for, right? And they're there because they don't have the continuity and comprehensiveness of somebody that they can trust and feel like they can wait, or they understand what's going on in their body and can actually get the solutions they need over time with the right place and the right time.
Thanks, Raj. I mean, I think we've managed to explore some of the key topics that I was really keen to discuss with you today. And I think there are many more avenues that we could go down. But, as we kind of come to a conclusion, I really wanted to discuss the topic of medical culture a bit more with you. It's a topic we discuss a lot on my podcast, and I think I'm increasingly really curious about the intersection and what I think is the interconnectedness, intimate interconnectedness of well-being and diversity, equity and inclusion. I was fortunate to peer review a really nice qualitative research paper on this the other week. And it was the first that I'd really seen that kind of incorporated, this into the research. And I think there's a lot of really exciting things that they can, and work that they can do on the back of this. I have also referred a few times to the podcast to a really lovely paper by the Stanford Will MD group, Healing the Professional Culture of Medicine. Is something that I frequently refer back to, and I will link it again in the show notes. And I think on this, the other thing that I think about frequently is the work and the King's Fund that Sarah Dalton referred to on my podcast with her, and how they teased out what's important for us in healthcare as clinicians is the ABCs. Again, a framework I can get around as an emergency physician, but the autonomy, belonging, and contribution as being key needs, partly values that we have in healthcare. And I think this belonging piece is so important. I think that is universally important. We know from work looking at the social determinants of health that isolation and loneliness are as concerning and as are risky as smoking. And so, I think I would really like to, discuss with you, how you think with an appreciative inquiry lens, we can harness this for strength in medicine and, co-create a better future for healthcare. How can we come together as a profession, and harness the power of belonging and community?
Yeah. That's a tough question, Cheryl.
I think listening to your podcast helps. I think that it is a means of connection.
Yeah, I think that's where I'm leaning towards. I don't think I've thought about it in that specific question that you're talking about, but ultimately, I think about what do people want out of their work. It's some moments of purpose, hopefully a lot of those, some moments of joy, and moments of belonging. And how do you try to get all of those in one way or another? Because they all fluctuate depending on what's happening at the time. But you want to experience all of that in your job, and especially with the people you're working with. I think about this a lot too. I spend a lot of time at work. Although I have kids that are like so excited to see me, I have to like run home to see them for an hour before they go to bedtime. But I spend most of my time with my colleagues. And sometimes actually we're really bad at building that relationship with each other and become siloed and then slowly alienated when there's so much opportunity to build relationship around something that we're all doing at the same time. Like we never face each other. We're all facing outward, right? And I think equity oh, go ahead. You were going to say something.
No, I'm just saying you're a community organizer. How do you build community amongst your colleagues?
Yeah, it's thinking about what people's interests are and getting a commitment from them. Not in a superficial way of like trying to sell them something, like what are you interested in? And like what's important to them? What do they value? What do they believe in? And what is that like what are they interested in? Because everybody like came to medicine in a way and something is driving them. And sometimes we lose that connection within ourselves. So sometimes it's hard to express. But if you're able to name that for each person, then we can find a common ground and then get people's commitment to move together towards some goal together, right? And I don't love goals. Like we don't always have to set goals. So I use the word intentionality. There's just some intention that we set with each other, regardless of if we achieve some arbitrary metric or where we want to go. It's like the journey itself is important, right? And there's intentionality to it. And I think with this podcast, we talk about my community a lot. It's really helped just the people I'm interacting with, because now getting people to come on this boat or this like journey with me of like, hey, we can do better than what we're doing. And listen, like these people have amazing knowledge in the community. And then people are listening to it with me. And then we're talking about these topics that maybe we weren't. For example, something just came up. I don't think it's in any of my episodes yet, but we screen people with dementia with a tool called MoCA.
Mm.
I don't know if that's used there. It's Montreal Cognitive Assessment. Do you all use that?
Now ask my best running friend who's a neuroscientist who does work exactly in this space. She will
Yeah.
have heard of it, I'm sure.
And the thing is, we were talking about this, and we have all these translated forms. And initially, I was like, yeah, we just got to get it in enough languages, and then we'll do better for screening for dementia for all these communities because sometimes language is a barrier. But then it came out, hey, like, just so you translate the tool doesn't mean it actually communicates what you're trying to communicate. And I think this tool, MoCA, is ineffective for different communities. There's actually a different tool called Rudus that's actually good because it was created for culturally diverse communities and won't fall short in these specific ways that this tool does. So now we were engaging conversations that we weren't before. Um, and I think it helped us feel like we were making progress in places that we weren't before because there's this feeling of stagnation and routinization, if that's a word, of providing care that we can all get stuck in once you're out of the educational realm if you're not connected to the right spaces, right? It's like such a different feeling, Cheryl, like going from medical school to residency and all of a sudden work. All of a sudden it's just
Yeah.
like, hey, like you just see patients, you're based on like, we need you to be productive, and then you need to like pay back your loans. So there's this like practicality to it and the curiosity and creativity that sometimes you had in medical school and residency slowly kind of goes away. And trying to instill that again can build community too. So there's so many facets to that, but
And so you brought up your own values, reconnecting with purpose. That loss of creativity, I think, is a powerful one. We've spoken about that a few times on my podcast. I think when I was at Stanford last year, I think Tate showed this very depressing graph of taking, medical students and then following that trajectory through residency where there's just this progressive narrowing of their interests and loss of that,
yeah.
enthusiasm, creativity. You've reclaimed that for yourself. I think podcasting is a great outlet for creativity. And you've spoken a lot about reconnecting with your why and your values and going back and doing the work. How do you think we take a primary prevention approach to this and build it in from day one? It's a conversation I've had with several guests. I've spoken with Tammy about it recently, with Andrea. I'm on this journey. I'm still doing the work.
Yeah. And you've probably gotten a lot of good answers. I'll say for me, I've done different ways I've done all these workshops and worksheets on finding your values. Brene Brown is like loves doing that, right? So I don't think that's how you're going to find your values.
No,
But
I agree.
I'll say I'd like the list to reflect and to constantly keep reflecting on like not what's been imposed on you by society, but what is actually inherently natural to you and what do you actually purposely want to choose for yourself of values. So there's a few things that from my journeys from achievement ambition to growing to like love and generosity of how do I approach work that way. And then like there's these four other things that I always gravitate towards, which is creating, connecting, learning, and growing, right? That's me. Like it doesn't have to be everybody. So if you asked me what would have been helpful for me going through school, medical school, and residency, because I'm trying to reclaim that now, right? That's part of my story, is like people saying, you're going to be a doctor, but actually you can do a lot of things as a doctor. And these are all the possibilities. And you're going to have room in your career to do it and room in your daily life because your identity is not going to be collapsed into a singular identity. But that's not what we're taught, right? We're doctors. Like we see patients, see visits. Thing that we have to value is history, assessment and plan, we put in the right code, bill, the end. And I don't think I even knew that this was possible. And I'm trying to find it for myself, let alone be supported in the journey, right?
And I think that's changing. I really do think that's changing. I think the next generation that I'm already seeing that shift. And going back to your history, that the idea of history of present and complaint, I
Yeah.
love that the dialogue you had around that, because it is one of the first things that we learn. But I already have a different way of looking at that when I hear that phrase now. The curiosity, let's get curious
Yeah.
about the patient in front of me and their story and why they're here, and how we can connect. Before we go on to the closing questions, because I think I could probably talk to you for hours. Anything
Yeah.
else that you would like to share with my audience? Anything else you think we haven't covered that, I think there's probably deeper layers for a lot of the topics we've skimmed over. An hour's not long. But I'd welcome any further thoughts, any closing messages, because I do always get some gold at this point in the conversation. I'm sure in your podcasting journey, you are now familiar with that.
Yeah. Um, I don't think anything specific. I think about maybe community organizing.
Yeah, I'd love to know a bit more about that work in practice, because I'm not sure I'm entirely clear about what it actually looks like and what you do.
I know there's a whole model for this, right? But and everything's going to seem like platitudes because you have to really dive deeper into it. But another saying that we have in community organizing is that you turn the resources you have into the power you need to make the change you want. And there's a lot captured in that we often don't have everything we need to make the change we want. We don't have the resources. It could be anything as abstract as time, attention, energy, or it could be something very concrete and tangible like financial resources. But you have what you have, and you're going to find people in this community and around you who have other resources with similar interests and values. And you're going to combine those resources to turn into something we have, whatever it is. And you're going to see how can you turn those resources into a certain type of power. And power sometimes feels like a dirty word. And this is said a lot in community organizing too, because power seems something that you abuse, but ultimately power is just the ability to make change. So you're just building enough power to make the change that you as a group or you as the community feel like we need to make. And that can be really purpose driven, that whole journey. So it still might seem like a foreign concept, but like community organizing at the crux of it is like you find your people. Like, who are your people? Right? Like, you really have to answer it. Not like the person next to me, like, hey, like, or my family, but like, who are your people? Who like believe the same things that you do? And are they working towards the same thing with you?
Find your
Then
tribe.
you like, right? Like, then find a purpose, an intention. Like, hey, like, we all believe the same things. We want this change. And you get together and then find ways to combine the resources into some specific change that you want. And I feel like it's really empowering because, especially in healthcare systems, we are entrenched in hierarchical systems where power seems very institutionalized. Like, unless I am the medical director or the district director or the CEO, like, I won't be able to change anything, right? There's that sense of that. And I can say, because I'm the medical director, and I'll say, hey, like, you can have all this power, and you're going to find there's like whole set of another constraints, and you can end up in the same place. And I want people to understand that community organizing is accessible form wherever you are.
And so, in practice, in your
Yeah,
community, can you
yeah,
give me a nice example of that coming together that has created something bigger than an individual would have been able to do in terms of impact?
yeah. Let's talk about two things. One is I do some community organizing just within my organization. We have a whole equity, inclusion, and diversity plan, right? We have strategies, we have a plan for that. But somebody came to me and they said, you know what is really a problem here? And I want you to hear this, and I want you to hear my story, is that we shame people around weight. And I'm not saying that lightly because I've suffered with eating disorder and I'm a larger body person. But every time I go into any healthcare system, they ask me about my weight. They weigh me every time I go in. They tell me to lose weight. They don't know my story. They tell me advice that actually ends up harming me because I then feel self guilt and I suffer from depression. And say we need to change this. And the resources they were bringing to the table was that their story. They know a lot of knowledge about like what could be a different approach. And then for me, I was the leader of a group of people who are called the health equity team, trying to organize and implement community organizing to make change. So she connected with me, and then I connected with people within my group who were like, hey, like, I didn't even think about this. Has anybody else experienced the same thing or feel the same way? And there was tons of people. They just couldn't share it, right? So now it's not all the entire group, but certain people. So then we formed that group together. Then we figured out what are like the 8 things that we need to change so people aren't being harmed or our current approach. Then we have specific steps. And then we figured out who can make that change and does anybody have that relationship for that person who has the power to set the guidelines or set the standard work. So then we use that. So then there's a whole plan. We're like, wait, first of all, people need to be aware of this. We brought in speakers. We like did one-on-one conversations with people. And then we somehow got influence over the guidelines committee. And then we had specific changes happen where is that now everybody who comes in needs to have permission to be weighed. So they ask, they don't say, hey, step on the scale. They say, do you want to be weighed today? And it's such a small change, but it seemed like impossible to change from that person who came to me because it seems so standardized. But now we've organized and somehow gotten this one specific thing changed. And it seems so small, but it meant the world because now they don't have to do this every time they come in because they have a scale, they know what's good for them, right? But it's made a specific change. So things like that. This that's my first example.
Yeah, no, it's great.
Yeah. And the podcast itself, I feel like is a community organizing for me because I am constantly reaching out to people and seeing what they have available resource-wise and what their interests and values are. Because I have a specific goal of educating clinicians to become better healers for culturally diverse communities. But a lot of people in the community are already distrustful that this is going to be just taking advantage of them, that I'm going to impose something on them. I'm not going to really actually respect their voice or honor their values. That's going to be othering. Or they're kind of exhausted just doing their work. Like it could be Afghan and Ukrainian refugees. They're like, I'm drowning in paperwork. I'm just trying to get the care that I need. Like, I don't have time to do this, right? So I'm engaging with people and trying to have this conversation over and over. And there's all these subparts to community organizing too. That's why I started with the story, because every time I meet with them, I got to show them like, this is me, this is what I believe in. And we're going to get to the crux of like, do we have aligned values and can we move together towards a goal with commitment? So my story about, hey, this is how I started, this is what I want to do, and I want clinicians to be better, just like me, and I'm trying to use voice to do it. Does that seem like something that resonates with you? Right? I get to that quickly. It's not like small like chit chat, right? Like, not saying I don't talk about the weather, but there's a purposefulness and intentionality. I keep using that word, right? When you're reaching out to people because you're kind of focused on something specific.
I'm so glad you're the medical director.
Yeah. That's a small place right now, but
nice. Before I know you've got to go and see a lot of patients this afternoon, is there anything around about some of the topics that we've been reading, that we've been talking about that you'd recommend for reading, listening, viewing, or is there just something fun that you have been engaging with that you recommend at the moment?
So many options, but I'll put
fun
a plug
history.
in for I know, fun history. I'll put in a specific plug. I was looking at this because I had read it a little bit ago, but it's called Sand Talk by Tyson Yonka Porta. Hopefully I'm saying that name right. How indigenous thinking can save the world. And that's actually really interesting because the premise of it, there's actually a lot of things in that book that's very interesting. The premise of it is how we sometimes narrow down indigenous thinking to like herbs that they've used in the past. Like that's all they can offer when it's a completely different approach to life and healing. An example that I still think about because I haven't read that book in a while is he, I think, brings up a study about fish oil. It's like, oh yeah, like a research study came out that fish oil doesn't work. And then he says, but like, is it the fish oil or is I want to know more. Like, where was the salmon caught? Like, what season was the salmon caught in? And how was the salmon treated and where was it? Like, there's so many details to why salmon is actually life-giving and can be healing, not necessarily just the fish oil. And this context matters in how it can heal you. And there's an indigenous way of thinking and the interconnectedness that's completely lost. And there's a big gap, right? Because we still try to isolate every component and we don't think about the context at all. The seasonality and all these things are so foreign. And no research study is going to tell you that, right?
No,
Like,
no.
you know, and I think I still think about that and how it opened my mind so much to be like, yeah, like that's so true.
You're going to have to write that one down for me because I think I want to read that myself, and we'll put it in the show notes as well.
Yeah, sounds good. And I'll check in with you, see if you liked it as much as I did in a few
Done,
months.
done. You've given us a bit of insight into this question, but what does well-being mean for you now, today, professionally, personally?
Yeah, I well-being for me right now is feeling like I'm doing the things that I want in the ultimate constraint of time because I have two kids that are ever the time they need is ever expanding and I can actually fill all empty spaces in your day. So I have to be really clear about my priorities and how I show up in my different roles as a father, as a doctor, as a son. Um, and I have to keep reminding myself about that. At the same time, not forgetting myself. And that actually is a hard goal because every day I have to ask that question myself because it changes weekly. Like, man, this week I didn't talk to my parents at all. Like, is there something coming up that I talk to them? Or hey, like I really didn't show up for my wife and kids. I was like editing this podcast every every night for the last few days, right? I gotta like chill and just be present for a week and trying to find that just because there's a way to approach this where I can stop doing a lot of things that I'm doing, which I think my wife would like. But I think I'm trying to always answer that question so I don't feel like I'm losing myself in the things that I want to do. And I have to ask that question pretty consistently because it is hard to make it happen in any single day.
And I loved at the beginning, and you gave me that context, and then said, and I started this podcast because it was, part of bringing together a lot of what I was working towards. But I was just thinking, and all the hours you spend editing, and all the hours you spend researching, and then all the hours you do, and it's so much fun, but it is very time consuming.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
when you are pushing the limits and you are struggling, what are your go-to tools? You mentioned some of them. I think you have a meditation practice that you've spoken about. What does that look like? What else do you bring in?
I think the first thing is just not looking at a computer screen. I actually stare at this all day long in my work, podcasting. So, like, getting physically into a different space. This is also a different way of thinking because we undervalue our physical spaces and our bodies. So, getting my body to move outside, if I can just do that, it'll snap me out of so many things. And
Me
sometimes I'm
too.
really uncomfortable and not feeling well, and I can't pin it down. And sometimes I don't know the answer. I mean, sometimes it's because I haven't drank water in like 10 hours, but other times I just get outside with my body being present. Yeah. And it helps so much. And I feel like we just don't make, again, space for
Mm.
it during our daily work. I wish we did. I wish we could move towards something like that in the future. But at this time, I think just doing that can help me.
So that leads on to your ideal self-care Sunday, and it might not fall on a Sunday, but if you were to design a perfect day for yourself, what would it look like?
Oh gosh, this is what I would do, Cheryl. I would wake up. My older son wakes up first. I would go in there and I wouldn't force a schedule onto him. I wouldn't say, get dressed, we got to get down, we got to eat breakfast, and then I got to get going, so we got to say goodbye. I would just stay there and then be on toddler time, which is actually a time, like an
Sounds
approach to
like
time
playtime.
that, yeah, it's like 100% playtime, 100% whatever's in front of you, we're going to commit to it. And it could be I chose this stick and I want to play with these leaves for the next 20 minutes. And we're just going to
Brilliant.
hang out because, hey, like, what's the concept of time, right? So there's a sense of this fluidity of time and just being present. And then we go outside, and I actually really like a cup of coffee because I don't drink during coffee during the week, but I drink lattes. It's like a special treat on Saturday with my wife. And then we take a walk, just all of us together. And I think that's an ideal start for my day to kind of like, I'll say snap out of it because there's this relentlessness to the things I have to do sometimes.
Perfect. I think I got to have my ideal self-care Sunday a few weeks ago, but it was elements of all of that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time. I know that you've got patients to go and see. I think the work you're doing is important. I think it has immense value, and I'm really looking forward to more of my audience engaging with your podcast. I hope that we will be able to connect again, and I hope that I can actually maybe you'll come to Australia and you can have an Australian latte. Melbourne is the coffee capital of
Yeah.
Australia.
That sounds fun. Yeah. And if you come here, I got Seattle also has a reputation for coffee. So if you're around here.
Yeah, you had the emergency physician at coffee. I think on that, Raj, I am now planting little seeds, but I'm hopeful that I'll be able to return to the US in 24 as part of my studies. And I would love to tag on to that little trip and tour and visit all of you. So all of my incredible medical podcasting friends. So yourself and Andrea again, and Dan and Mark, and Jonathan Fisher is coming on the podcast next month. It would be wonderful to build that all in. I'm getting excited now. Keep up the great
Uh,
work. Yeah,
Cheryl.
I'm pretty confident our paths will keep crossing.
Yeah, yeah. And keep doing the great work too. I loved all of the people you've had.
Cheers. Have a
All
good
right.
day.
You too. Bye.
You have been listening to the Mindful Medic podcast with Dr. Raj Sundar. I hope you enjoyed today's episode as much as I did recording it. I will put a link in the show notes to Raj's website, healthcareforhumans.org, and to the podcast, Healthcare for Humans. And I know on the back of today's conversation, you are going to want to download and start listening to season 1. I will also put a link in the show notes to the book recommendation that Raj gave at the end of our conversation. If you think a colleague would enjoy this episode, please send them a link and share. And if you haven't already subscribed, I'd also appreciate if you could take some time to rate and review. That really helps us grow this community. So I look forward to joining you next time. We have a really exciting guest list lined up for season 4, and I'm looking forward to having and introducing some more wonderful guests. Until then, take care.
We all experience more and more. I'm realizing this feeling of emptiness once you get to that next step, right? Hey, like I did so well in high school, I'm going to get to the college I want. Then I'm going to get into medical school I want. Then I get to the residency I want. And in between, I did a lot of great things that I studied hard for and worked hard for. But every time I got to that place, there was a sense of emptiness because the next day, the question always was, now what? Right? Like, what's next? Because it wasn't inherently satisfying. And again, a lot of people feel this, but for me, it was especially powerful because of where I started, because I didn't even have that fear of going anywhere else. So I was just in a place of privilege trying to achieve things for myself. There's nothing bigger than myself.
The MBA New South Wales ACT does wonderful work for those of our colleagues who are, at this very minute, experiencing a hard time. One way you can show you care about doctors' welfare is to go to their website, www.mbansw.org.au, and donate today. Knowing that their colleagues' care is a big part of these doctors' recovery, so please be part of the solution. All donations are tax deductible. If you can, please consider a monthly donation, as even small amounts collectively will allow them to plan their growth to support the increased demand.